Hello, everyone. Welcome back to My Life In seminar series from the Center for Minorities Research, where we explore the professional journeys of individuals working with minorities and vulnerable communities. In each session, we reflect on both the challenges and rewards of these careers and ask our guests to make this work, what makes this work meaningful and fulfilling. Thank you all for joining us today. We are very pleased to have with us Dr. Alasdair Gordon-Gibson and David Horobin, Senior Crisis Management Advisor at Geneva Centre for Security Policy. Dr. Alasdair will introduce David in more detail shortly. Dr. Alasdair has over 25 years of experience in humanitarian response, primarily with the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. His work has included senior leadership roles with the ICRC, IFRC, and British Red Cross across a range of contexts, including Iraq, Syria, Myanmar, Kosovo, India, Moscow, and Damascus. He is currently an honorary lecturer at the University of St. Andrews in the Graduate School for Interdisciplinary Studies and holds both an MPhil and a PhD from the University of St. Andrews. We are delighted to have you both with us today. Dr. Alasdair, over to you.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much, Camilla, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. First of all, thank you, Camilla, for that introduction, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. Let me make a quick introduction in more depth of my time with David. We first worked together in response to the exodus of refugees from Rwanda following massacres there in 1994, when an estimated 800,000 refugees fled into what was then Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and another 300,000 approximately into Tanzania and Burundi. So this was an exodus of around about 1 million, or even just over 1 million people in the space of about 5 days. So this was quite an operational challenge. And it was a response that was very publicly and perhaps threw up these challenges in a public way that hadn't been experienced before. It had just been the arrival of cable television, and the media circus was there in full. So that set the sights for the way I structured my research and my subsequent career. We were faced with these moral dilemmas, pitting humanitarian action against questions of human rights. And this is a persistent challenge to us all. I think it's probably something that David will touch on. And I'm sure it's something that's common to people working in the Center of Minorities Research as well, these kinds of moral dilemmas in aid and development. We subsequently worked together again in Russia, in Syria, in Jordan, and then at headquarters in Geneva, all with its own differing contexts and challenges, many of which will be quite familiar, I think, to you, I hope. And we hope also this will, in the next 45, 50 minutes or so, raise some provocative questions and reflections on our work together. So let's begin. David, welcome. And perhaps you could begin by telling us, you have now over 30 years experience from both the public and the private sector in humanitarian work. Can you give us an idea of how you joined that, how you got along, started in work in that sector?
Sure. Thanks, Alasdair, and thanks, Camilla, for inviting me to this session. I'm very happy to be here. Yes, I've been around a long time in kind of ICRC terms, International Committee of Red Cross terms. I'm nowadays called, a crocodile, having been probably to nearly every major, certainly conflict-related emergency, but also very often on disaster-related emergencies within the Red Cross over the last 30 years or so. So how did I get into it? Well, it's kind of a mix of good fortune, being at the right place at the right time, and having a specific skill set that was required. I did my first degree in social studies and economics, and I did my thesis on the profile and the evolution of truck drivers in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. I then got an MSc place at Imperial where I studied logistics, in fact, transport engineering as it was called at the time. And going back to the end of the 80s, the early 90s, this was a very new thing. It's such a big thing these days, but that time ago, it was pretty new, and there were new concepts coming in, such as JIT, just in time, merging, supply lines, supply systems, distribution systems, warehousing, MRP, minimum resource planning, and so on and so forth. So it is a pretty unusual thing at that time, certainly to do a master's in. I think there are only about 3 places that did it. Cranfield, I think Gloucester and Imperial. And so I did that, and I got recruited through what was then called the Milk Round, and I started working in logistics for one of the big then emerging 3PLs, third-party logistics companies. When distribution was starting to be fully integrated and you were having big companies doing distribution logistics for a range of organizations such as FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods, and supermarkets and so forth. And so I did that for a number of years. And then I was a volunteer for the Red Cross. And one day I got a call from my boss. I was junior in the office at the time. I got a call from my boss and says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm working on this project." And he says, "Oh, well, we want you to go and work for the Red Cross." And I said, "Well, okay." What was all of this about? And it transpired that the chairman of the British Red Cross at the time was also the chairman of the company I was working for. So I didn't have a lot of choice in the matter. And the next thing I knew was I was in a little Twin Otter flying over Angola, and spent the next 6 months working in Angola during the war, the conflict that was going on at that time, and did a really fascinating mission trying to put in logistics systems for quite a complex operation. I went back to my office and they said, "Oh, who are you?" "Oh, yes, we remember you went off to the Red Cross." And I went back into it for a while. And then one day I got a call from the Red Cross in Geneva, from the SRC in Geneva, and said, "Would you come to work for us?" Because they wanted to professionalize logistics, because it had then been split into different functions: procurement, finance, operations, but there was no single unit handling supply chain issues. And they were very, very busy and they had a lot of stuff on. And so I spent the next few years of my life really setting up logistic systems, both at headquarters and then in the field, and putting in what was really then kind of basic logistics systems, creating regional hubs, logistics hubs. And I think this was a very rewarding time because I was taking fairly simple principles and putting them into kind of complex settings. Because in the background, there was, with the donors at that time, there was a recognition that logistics costs on humanitarian operations were huge. Something 60, 70, sometimes 80% of the overall budget of humanitarian operation, it's still the case today, was around logistics costs. And audits had been done and people have been found deficient in basic things like warehousing, transportation systems, and so forth. And so that's really how I got into it. I specialized in vehicles, transportation, and fleet. And nearly everywhere I went, I found, disaster stories of very generous vehicles being sent, trucks being sent, and after, a few months, they were destroyed for different reasons: road conditions, inappropriate specifications, and no maintenance and no training, no driver training, um, and things like that. Um, for those of you who may remember, there was Band-Aid back at the end of the 80s in Ethiopia. Uh, um, and I went to Ethiopia and set up, and Alasdair was there, um, to set up really a lot of systems around that, because the context was brutal in terms of logistic systems. The roads were terrible. There was no training. And so people would send, brand new stuff, and it would be destroyed in a very short period of time. And so that's kind of, Alasdair, as how I kind of got into it as a professional logistician, and then spreading out over the years, logistic systems, especially for new emergencies that were happening, to set up the initial corridors and supply systems and so forth.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think, as I found the same, many of us do, this interface between the private sector, the skills and professionalism of the private sector with the humanitarian sector is a very, very dynamic part of our work with its own challenges. I'm wondering, can you say something about the switch from working in the private sector, as you say you started, to the humanitarian sector? I mean, which skills or experiences were most transferable, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the humanitarian sector was probably 15, 20 years behind in terms of, logistic systems. And because they are so expensive, um, and, donors and the general public were, happy to send goods, clothes, contributions, sometimes food parcels, and there's a few stories of what a disaster that can be. Um, but they were not particularly either aware of the complexity and the cost of the logistics systems. And so I think that, what the key thing I would say, my career, which has been a very rewarding career, has been to set up these systems, to recruit people, to recruit local staff wherever there was a particular emergency, getting in basic systems training, getting these people then to assume responsibility and to create, as I did, the function of a logistician, which didn't exist before. And so I think that doing good recruitment, doing good training, and having basic systems was the most transferable thing. I've always said, and I think you may recall it, Alasdair, that you can run a complete logistics operation on 3 pieces of paper. You don't need massive complexity, which is the case today with ERPs and so forth. But by trying to create a skill set, training on that skill set, giving exposure, I think was really the most transferable thing, and getting the right people in as quickly as possible, building trust. And I've been very happy in my career to see that some of the people that I trained years and years ago have now gone on to be, professional logisticians all over the world and with different agencies, UN and INGOs, NGOs, and so forth. So that's been a very rewarding thing.
Yeah, I think you touched on really a very critical point in my own research, and I know it's something that interests the students I work with and help in St Andrews. You talked about trust So effective action in the humanitarian sector relies heavily on building trust to get access. So a lot of the discussions at the moment to do with trust and an apparent loss of confidence in the humanitarian sector. So has trust in the sector diminished, do you think? And if so, why is this?
Yeah. I mean, in the role that I have at the GCSP, the Geneva Centre for Security Policy today, we do a lot of training on crisis management with officials from governments, from UN agencies, from European Commission, and one of the core areas that I like to emphasize is this notion of trust. And I think trust is a two-way street. It's trust within your own team and trust for you, whatever organization you represent, to the external stakeholders. And I get often asked the question, what is trust? What do we mean by trust? And I'd like to come back later on, Alasdair, to the question of, crisis, because that's what I do. It's what I've done all of my life. And I think it's the same kind of thing. We have to say, what do we mean by crisis? And what do we mean, for example, about trust? And I think, you can ask the question openly in a training session, and people say, well, yes, it's about, empathy and management styles and being honest and truthful and this kind of thing. But what I have found is that when you're in a real crisis situation where lives are at stake, trust is a very important part to build and to train in advance. And there's a very interesting book called The Trusted Advisor by a guy called Professor Green. And he examined the notion of trust in high stakes environments, where it's a high shock or potential of a high shock with high consequences, whether it be financial, whether it be operational, humanitarian, life-saving activities. And he looked primarily at the financial sector, so looking, for example, how hedge fund teams build trust. But as well, he looked at other teams, surgical teams, military teams, who need a high degree of trust amongst themselves and externally. And he said, that trust is really built on three factors. Competence, so skills and knowledge in what it is that you are doing, whether you're finance or logistics or a heart surgeon. Reliability, meaning that you can be still able to produce what you can do well, on time, reliably, under stress. And then thirdly, he said that, and I agree, that's why I like his notions, even though I've adapted it for the work that I do. It's about intimacy. That is understanding what other people in your team are doing, understanding who they are as a person, having time to bond together. And those three elements in his equation. However, what completely negates trust and trustworthiness is self-interest. So you can build a good team, but if in there somewhere there is an element of somebody just going for self-interest, whether it be at a personal level or at an organizational level, this can destroy trust. I think, the notion of, trust walks into the room and can run out on a horse, I think this is very true. And I've seen that in many different contexts. And there are contexts we can think about today where many, many years of effort has been destroyed by one, should we say, self-interested action on behalf of an individual or an organization. So I think trust is a very important component, and you need to break it down and give it to people in a way that they can understand it and recognize it and understand their own behaviors. because for me in crisis management, it's not just about technical systems and so forth. It's about behaviors, and behaviors is
Yeah.
so important.
Yeah, no, thank you, David. That rings very true with my own research. Looking at the humanitarian identity in the complexities of modern complex emergencies. And social scientists such as Tom Tyler, and Peter DeGoey say a similar thing, that trust is really built on two things. Efficiency is, in your words, competency. It's efficiency and intent. And it's that intent, it's that display of humanity that must help to bring trust. And it's that human element, perhaps, that is beginning to be mistaken or missed in some of the modern constructions of the humanitarian sector. So that brings me to the question, do the current laws and principles that have guided the sector for over 150 years now, do they remain relevant? And what about the structures that support them? How have these evolved, and are they still are they a problem? So can you just say something about the modern principles and structures guiding the sector?
Well, I mean, I think the humanitarian sector is going through a real difficult time at the moment, for a number of complex reasons, and there'll be, other academics and practitioners who will have, strong views on that. But, in my career now, spanning on for 30 years in it, I think the trust is in the lowest ebb that I've seen for a while. And if we take some of the organizations that I've worked with, building trust with different populations, different authorities, different agencies takes a long time, and it requires human interaction. It requires adapted behaviors, and time to invest, and knowledge of the context, knowledge of the populations, especially when minorities come into play, and keeping the self-interest part focused on, the beneficiaries. What are you there to do, and how do you get that point across to them? And when there is a sense that self-interest is not what they thought you were talking about, then it just disappears. And I think this is a little bit the world that the humanitarian system is in at the moment. There's been a breakdown of trust, right the way from the very top level to the field level, and building that back. I think there first of all has to be a reflection to say, well, we have lost trust, and so how do we try to get it back? But I come back to the point, in order to do that, you need to say, well, what do we mean by trust? When agencies become highly politicized, for example, there can be a breakdown in trust. It may be fine for, a certain faction or a certain group, but not for another group. And if you're really there on a pure humanitarian action, looking at the fundamental humanitarian principles, then it's a pretty uphill battle.
You mentioned earlier that you're particularly interested, and I know from your own work, on understandings of crisis. So let's return to that for a second. Do you think a misunderstanding of crisis is what's leading part of this dysfunction now? How do you read understandings of what constitutes a crisis now in modern contexts?
Right. I think this is a really important point, because I'm a so-called professional crisis manager, and one of the things that we need to think about, especially in the last decade or so, is that everything today is a crisis. And people talk about polycrisis, and we have to ask the question: is it really a crisis, or is it an emergency that, there is a solution, and that solution needs to be applied. The problem, I think, today is that when we use the word crisis in English, it is emotive. And politicians love the word crisis. The media love the word crisis because it gets clicks and looks, and people can set up and say, well, I'm going to, navigate my way out of this particular crisis. And it comes back to that point of self-interest. So some organizations do not really, in my opinion, make a clear enough distinction between a true crisis, which is, an unexpected, unforeseen event of which there are no particular, which hasn't been experienced before, or if it has, the existing capacity, capability is insufficient to manage the situation. People also don't recognize that there is an international standard now, which only came out in 2022. It's ISO 22361, for those of you who may want to follow it, which spent many, many years, and I was part of some of the working group on this definition, which looks at crisis management, and it starts with a definition, which I won't read it off pat, but it's basically unforeseen, unexpected event which has high impact and of which there are not adequate systems or processes or capacities to do it, and which requires A, making decision in a short time, and B, good leadership. If you dig into the ISO in more depth, it also says that crisis management must also not just be about response systems and mechanisms, but is also about ethics. It's about leadership. It's about culture, and for example, use of whistleblowers and so forth, in terms of effective crisis management. And I think this is very true. So, one of the things that we do, and I've done for a number of years now, last 10 years or so, is try to get, especially decision makers, to understand what is a crisis and how, if they're going to manage this crisis, how can they navigate their way through this crisis in terms of leadership and decision making. And one of the things that has to be done is to understand it's about behavior, internally and externally. So it's about who you are. And, there's plenty of social science work done in, behavioral styles. But in order to have effective crisis management, you need to have trust, you need to have leadership. And in order to do that, you need to understand in your team the particular styles and of people. So I think that the behavioral aspects is very important in effective crisis management. But I come back to the point that we need also make to distinguish between an emergency, which is an event that can have impact, but of which there are processes or protocols or standard operating procedures that are already existing and in place, and that can be applied. Now, of course, an emergency can spin out of control if it's not managed well and turn into a crisis. But for me, not everything today is a crisis. But, for the average person, citizen on the street, reading the newspapers and listening to their politicians, they can sometimes get the impression that everything is a crisis. And I don't think that's true. And I think we need to be very careful about that.
Thanks, David. Yeah, you raised again some very important questions, which I think will be of interest to the people listening to us today from the Centre for Minorities Research. I mean, to do with yes, there are certain protocols in some emergencies which don't make them a crisis. However, there will be vulnerable groups, some minorities that, despite there being these structures in place, are left heavily exposed. So the question is, and I suppose, how does that? You talked about the behavior of the humanitarian, the behavior of population supporting people affected by a crisis, and is there a particular structure that needs to be built to help bring back and support and bring the focus onto helping the most vulnerable, which perhaps has been lost a bit in the polycrisis you talked about, attitude of reacting everywhere all the time. So how do you see the restructuring of the sector to bring the biggest impact to vulnerable groups?
I learned that the hard way in a way, because going back to Ethiopia during the different famines around in Ethiopia over the years, I was responsible for trying to get emergency assistance, food aid in this particular case, to a vulnerable population that had been identified through, through nutrition assessments, and who were in a poor state, a very poor state, jeopardized state. And we set up quite a complex supply system to treat and to help this vulnerable population. And one day, and this involved, big trucks going out day after day from one part of Ethiopia to the other. And one day, these trucks were stopped at gunpoint, and the drivers were taken hostage. And it transpired, to keep a long story short, it transpired that, each day they'd been driving through this nomad area full of nomads who were also in peril, but because they were nomads, the trucks were just like going past them. Sometimes they would be running over there and killing their goats. And one day they said, well, look, we've had enough. And, you have completely forgotten about us because we are nomads. And they took then, what they considered to be action to bring attention to their particular case, which was quite right. And I was fairly young at that time, and it's always stuck in my mind that you need a really good, solid contextual understanding of what's going on. Thinking, yes, well, here's a particular group of affected population that we need to do, but you need to understand what is in and around that context, and building up the picture of who is. So yeah, I think that experience comes into play here. But
Yeah, and thanks, David. I agree. So much my own experience too is context matters. There is no blueprint in the kind of work you do in crisis response. And it brings us to that very interesting and very complex moral dilemma again. At what point can we compromise principles according to context without becoming complicit? This idea of complicity and compromise. And I know it's something that we've all struggled with. And now the modern discussion is to do, going back to what I mentioned about the principles, one of the overriding of the four principles was neutrality, and that was guiding everything that humanitarians did on the field. But then now the shift is talking about, well, maybe we need to look at the context and be in solidarity with a lot of the most vulnerable. So it's this idea of what is ethical behavior in any given context. And I don't know if there's any particular missions. You mentioned your experiences in Ethiopia, but this question of ethics and managing that difficult moral balance, is there anything else you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's correct in the sense that, I could take another example, which is Chechnya, right? Which was when you look at places like Grozny, which were absolutely bombed, and the population there, the vulnerable population, were in a terrible state and needed a lot of support and help. But it was a complex operation. It was conflict. It was cross-line work, and each move. And I can remember, one particular mission going into Grozny, and it was not easy. And remember coming to checkpoints, and there were a lot of checkpoints along the way, and You had to plan and foresee those and have everything ready, be on time, have the right paperwork, etc., etc. But the soldiers who were on these checkpoints were young conscripts, and they were absolutely scared out of their mind, and they were not being fed properly. They had no provisions, and they were terrified. And that was a risk factor that we had to take into consideration. And so we decided that we would also help these young, severely traumatized soldiers, conscripts, at the checkpoints by providing them some food and some bandages and all of that. And that helped build up the trust because they too were a vulnerable group. Now, they may have been considered to be, the enemy for another part of this program, but they too had a role to play, and that also helped build the trust. And, so you need to think about the context. You need to think empathetically and with those that you're interacting with in a particular situation.
So to close for the next 5 minutes or so, let's look at the new emerging dynamics.
Yeah.
I mean, things have changed a lot since we started 30 odd years ago,
Sure.
David. Even structures have changed. There's cluster system in the United Nations, and even the codes of conduct and the sphere guidelines. All of these weren't part of our toolbox back in the early days, and that's all been developed. But now there are new dynamics, quite different. For example, what is the impact of artificial intelligence? There's all questions over data security, I think, in our sector, misinformation and disinformation, and also things like drone warfare that is challenging international humanitarian law that was, written many decades before that. Can you give us an update quickly in the last 5 or 6 minutes of our discussion about how you see the differing trends and how this might impact the sector?
Well, I'd like to weave that in, Alasdair, with also a question about, I gave at the beginning of this chat, how I kind of had a skill and then had a lucky break and then took a career decision to get into this humanitarian business, because it is a business. For people wanting to get into the humanitarian world today, I don't think the fundamentals have changed. You need to have a valued, useful, transferable skill set. Now, it won't necessarily be logistics because, that's mainstream these days, but, there's plenty of other stuff around that I think can be well applied into, getting a career, if people so want, in the humanitarian sector. And then, looking for that lucky break, looking for that, lift door that opens that can give you a break. But I still think that fundamentally that exists. And I have this discussion, with, quite a few people, still doing academic studies and so forth. So I think the opportunities are still there. AI is definitely one of them. Geospatial technology is another one. Things like cache systems, which I'm quite a big fan of, which are also quite complex, both technically and operationally, I think are still areas that are very, very useful. I mean, coming on to AI, yeah, I mean, this is such a big topic and one that we can't kind of back away from. And I have kind of two views on that. I mean, my colleagues at GCSP, a lot of discussion now in terms of AI being used in terms of military decision making. How is the future of warfare going to look with AI and, drone technology and swarm warfare and so forth. And the debates around should AI be considered a weapon when used in military decision making or not? And again, I think the jurists and so on are going to have an interesting time. And I think some are already looking at this in a lot of detail. When it comes to crisis management, if we, as we've discussed in this conversation, to say, let's really not conflate emergencies and crises, but really try to identify what is a true crisis. Where AI currently has a problem is it doesn't do context. We talked, Alasdair, about the importance of context, and whether that be proper identification of vulnerable populations and minorities. Um, AI is not good at context, and AI does not do human behavior. So, for me, as someone in the, kind of at the end of my career, those would be the two biggest worries I would have about AI. And it becomes a kind of easy way to do things, this AI hallucination, AI slop, and so on, which I've been reading about. And I indeed went into a couple of operations that I knew intimately, and using all the kind of correct prompts, tried to get AI to tell me, what were the root causes of the problems, and it failed miserably, and started giving me answers that the thing thought I wanted to help. Now, that may change over time, probably certainly will. But I think it's a dangerous thing at the moment. But in crisis management, by the way, that's what I'm talking about. It has its uses for sure, when mixed with things like geospatial data and so forth. So I think that what I see coming to the fore is the human aspect, the behavioral aspects, the contextual aspects that are being just pushed aside right now because, we have technology and we have AI and we have political missions, but behavior, and I mean that in its wider sense, as an organization trying to support, but as the individuals are trying to help, I think that's that's a big problem. So I think there's a lot of work to do that. There's definitely, I believe, an avenue for that. Where do you get good information from these days? Um, Going back to Angola, we had 3 communications with headquarters using HF radio per week. That was it. Nothing. And there was no day-to-day contact, but things worked well when there was less information available.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's brought us nicely towards the end of our discussion now back to where we really started about the importance of the human in humanitarian, that it's behavior, empathy, trust, and it's something that I personally get a bit concerned when we hear talking about a humanitarian reset, which is quite a buzz at the moment, when it suggests to me that it's just another rebooting of the existing system. Reset sounds too much like, well, we'll press a button, reboot it up, and we're going back to how we did it. Things have to fundamentally change. And I think the questions of engagement and disengagement sometimes are all going to be part of this new discussion. But that's going to be another podcast, perhaps. So I would like to say particularly a great thing. I really enjoy that discussion and give opportunities now for any questions and answers. Camilla, can I let you fire away and let us know what the chats are saying?
So Simon Pereira Shore is asking, what are the key points in communicating with local traumatized populations in disaster areas to build and maintain trust? And Emmanuel also asked, how would you deal with people who are suffering from disability and discrimination in the workplace, for example?
I have a kind of little bit of a story about people suffering from disability and discrimination in the workplace, talking about the workplace when I was in Afghanistan. And we had in the radio room, which was run 24 hours a day, people with disabilities. And they were absolutely brilliant. And again, I think it's about, finding a specific role that they could do, and especially when they are a key area of safety and security for everybody concerned. So I think that, with intelligence, with open mind, that in the humanitarian world, especially in field operations where I'm coming from here, is there is a role, and a very important role. The first question about was it about communicating with local traumatized populations in disaster, to build trust? Well, again, I think, I would say, you're here to help, right? But so important is to not only provide the help that is required, but to do that day after day, week after week, constantly, with value and with integrity, and to understand the awareness of the population that you're trying to help. So I think it's about having a discussion with the right people to say, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, this is what we need to do to work together. But then to do that, and to do that then consistently up until such a time as it's no longer required. Not to just sort of say, oh, well, this is what we're going to do, and then, like, gone. It's about building that level of trust.
If I could come into that one too, Simon, I think it was you that asked that question. Thank you. It's a very relevant question, of course, and it brings me immediately in mind to my time managing the operation early response to the tsunamis, the Asian tsunamis in 2004. I was in Sri Lanka at the time, and the goodwill to help was immense, but the methodologies sometimes were not the best. And one was handling, populations hugely traumatized by crisis of that scale. So lots of professional psychosocial support was flown in from countries who were brilliantly skilled at that within their own context, but were not at all effective or suitable for the context that they were sent to work in. And I think it's understanding the context, it's delegating proper skills, resources, and authority to the local without exposing them to risk too. I think, David, we've had this discussion before. This term localization can be a bit loaded sometimes, and it's something I'm not very comfortable with in many contexts, because it suggests delegating everything over, including risk, to the local, but in making sure that the response that we're providing in the case of, for example, a traumatized community, post-tsunami or post the massacres in Rwanda or anywhere else in the world, is relevant to the population that we're trying to help. That means really making sure we have a local response and making sure they're properly resourced to do that. That was certainly my experience at that time.
Absolutely. I think it was an American general who said, amateurs talk about strategy, professionals talk about logistics.
Yes.
Going back to the Asian tsunami, I was at DFID at the time, but there were all sorts of like wonderful ideas, and people sending stuff in and so on, but it was incompatible. It was incompatible either for the population, or it was incompatible because there was no systems on the ground to do it. So there was no fuel. Right, so people say, well, fly this in and fly that out, but there was no fuel, and so yeah, you really do have to have appropriate technology, redundancy. I mean, I think this is one of the biggest fears that I have at the moment is, with the high degree of fragile technology that we do, redundant systems like, talking to people, is going out of the way, going out of the window. So yeah, absolutely. I have so many stories. I think, Alice, you're aware of some of them where goodwill has been caused a disaster within a disaster. I mean, it happened in Haiti, it happened in Gaza several years
we
ago.
reinvent the wheel and make the same mistakes. But yes, you're absolutely right. Goodwill can not always lead to the best outcomes, and it's a real challenge.
Right.
Camilla, anything else on the chats, perhaps, or?
Yes, we have a final question also from Simon, and he's a logistic question. We are seeing
Yeah.
rapid development of unmanned aerial vehicles, especially in war zones such as Ukraine, for medium and heavy lift of cargo. How do you feel such technology, including autonomous UAVs, might open up new, safer, less leg transport options for disaster zones in coming years?
Yeah. Thank you, Simon. Yes, the famous last mile, which has always been a huge challenge in getting in, especially into disaster affected areas, natural disaster affected areas, and that kind of last mile challenge. And for sure, I think UAVs and the technology that is emerging and emergent around that will make a big difference and is making a big difference. Of course, I think there is one context where we're talking about, a natural disaster scenario, where you're trying to get, you know, medical supplies or relief supplies to an affected population for those that are closest or most impacted geographically. But in a conflict context, it becomes a little more challenging because the similar technology is going to be used in a non-humanitarian way. And I think that that will need to be carefully considered when looking at it from a purely humanitarian to deconflict, to use the word that used to be around a while ago, to deconflict technology based on the context and the demands that are required. I don't know where I've answered your question on that, Simon, but I think it's a very good one. But all I would say is that I don't think this last mile aspect has been around for decades.
We obviously,
Okay.
the Center for Minorities Research, want to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially to Dr. Alasdair and David for such a great conversation and insightful one. And yeah, is there any last words that David and Alasdair want to share with us?
Well, from my side, just thank you very much, David, particularly for your insights, and what I hope was a very, very challenging, very, very interesting discussion. And the dilemmas I don't think these moral dilemmas will ever go away. How do you twin good intent with a good outcome, and understanding context? But I think the recurring theme that came back to me was we have to keep the human element in our work. And I'm sure that goes across disciplines in academia as well as just our talk on humanitarian work. So that's thank you from my side, David. Anything else from your side?
Look, thank you for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure to have some discussions. But I would agree with you, Alistair. I think that we need to ask some fundamental questions like, what is a real crisis? Okay, what is real leadership in a crisis? How do we really understand what we mean by trust for internally within a responding team, or externally within different minority populations? And I think I think there's work to do on that issue. I also feel that there is, I think, still a good, interesting, rewarding, and fruitful career for people in this webinar, for humanitarian professionals. And even though it may be going through a bit of a difficult time at the moment, I still think it's a fantastic career, a rewarding career. And you need to identify those skills or those emerging skills, or build upon existing skills, and find that window of opportunity. I think people will be very grateful for expertise from people like are in this webinar. So that would be my closing remarks, and I wish you all the best future.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. So we look forward to welcome you to the next session of My Life in Seminar. Keep looking at our social media, and yeah, thank you all for being here. Thank you.